Light it up. Good evening. Hi, everybody. Great turnout. Good to see. Thank you for joining us for tonight's discussion. We're going to learn a lot. I feel confident. Just to provide a little context, in case this is your first time here, tonight's talk is the third in a three-part series on justice work that was organized by the Voices of Justice group here at Holy Faith. The first session was entitled Prophets, Peacemakers, and the Gospel Call to Justice, Speaking Truth from the Bible and the Witness of the Church. It was led by Pastor Andrea, Pastor Barry, Pastor Stan, and together they shared the basics for justice work from the perspective of the Bible and the positions of both the Episcopal Church and the ELCA. So to ground it clearly in theology and clearly in the sort of conventions of both of the churches. The second session was entitled Christian Civics, Raising Faithful Voices in the Public Square, and was led by Professor Judy Kohlberg and Mrs. Robin McCants, Assistant to the Bishop for Advocacy and Urban Ministry, Southeast Michigan Synod, ELCA. So again, tight connection between conventions of the church and social justice in action. They explored the many ways Christians in their roles as citizens have worked for justice and can continue to advocate for human rights, justice, and democracy. Tonight's session is entitled Welcoming the Stranger, Voices of Hope and Advocacy. We're hoping there's hope in there, hoping Voices of Hope and Advocacy for Immigrants, Refugees, and Asylum Seekers. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, why don't we start with a prayer? Let us pray. Jesus, when you multiplied the loaves and fishes, you provided more than food for the body. Your disciples were filled with fear and doubt, but you poured out your love and compassion on the migrant crowd, welcoming them as brothers and sisters. Today you call us to welcome the members of God's family who come to our land to escape oppression, poverty, persecution, violence, and war. Like your disciples, we too are filled with fear and doubt and even suspicion. We build barriers in our hearts and in our minds. Help us by your grace to banish fear from our hearts that we may embrace each of your children as our own brother and sister, to welcome migrants and refugees with joy and generosity while responding to their many needs, to realize that you call all people to your holy mountain to learn the ways of peace and justice, to share of our abundance as you spread a banquet before us, to give witness to your love for all people as we celebrate the many gifts they bring. Amen. Okay, so our speaker tonight is Jack Kanarak. He's an attorney for the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center. Jack was originally from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, so an immigrant of sorts, I suppose, where he lived up until 2020. Our next door neighbors are big Ohio State fans. We're going to do a welcome from them next week, and we're going to welcome the immigrants. Molly's planning it, might have a little edge to it, but we'll see. He moved to Michigan to attend the University of Michigan Law School, where he graduated in 2023. Jack was originally interested in public defense work, but he became interested in immigration during law school, where he partnered with the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center while in the school as part of an asylum clinic. Merck was his first job out of law school, and he's been working there for the past 2 years. He now lives around the border, can't make this stuff up, between Ypsilanti and Saline with his wife, Belle, and his 5-month-old daughter, Vera. So the fact that he's vertical with a 5-month-old is, testament to his dedication. Jack has promised to help us to understand the legal dimensions of immigration, current policies of the federal government, and challenges facing immigrant communities. I think our job with Jack will be to consider how our faith community can provide support and resources. So please join me in welcoming Jack.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me here today. Oh, are the slides up? Um, I love what you guys are doing here. I'm so glad that you're organizing around this issue. Hopefully, I can be a little help today. But yeah, so as James mentioned, my name's Jack. I'm a staff attorney with the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center. Uh, it's- ah, oh, oh, okay. So for those who don't know about us, the Michigan Immigrant Rights Center is a legal organization that provides legal assistance to immigrants all throughout Michigan. We primarily operate around southern to middle Michigan, Kalamazoo, Grand Rapids, Ypsilanti, Ann Arbor, those areas. But we do both legal services to the indigent immigrant community as well as some advocacy work, outreach work like this. We have both a normal immigration line, but we also do some employment law work for example, migrant immigrant workers. We have intake lines if you know someone who needs any sort of legal assistance who's an immigrant. Uh, they're welcome to call our intake lines Tuesday to Thursday. By the way, I'll be sharing these slides after all this, so don't feel pressured to write everything down. But you can also find these on Google, to be clear. We also have a line that you can call if you're actually in ICE detention facilities. We do provide assistance to people who have been detained. That number's actually, I think, even posted inside a lot of detention centers because you get a free phone call, and so you shouldn't need to memorize that. Okay, so today I know that you guys basically want a 101 type presentation, so I'm going to go over the basics, which is quite a lot, frankly. Hopefully not too much. Basically, how to immigrate here, what it's like living here as an immigrant, what it means to be deported, removed, things of that nature. Then I was going to cover some of the new challenges, particularly with this administration, that immigrants are facing. And finally, some words about what you might be able to do as an organization yourselves. Oh, also, I'm going to be covering a lot of ground. I'm sure you're going to have questions while I'm going through. I We're not going to record the question and answer section, and so just try to keep them to the end, even though I know it's going to be probably a little difficult. But yeah. All right, Immigration 101. Uh-oh. So just to start with, these are the basic government organizations involved in immigration. I'm sure you've all heard of these. You have the Department of Homeland Security, Department of State, and the DOJ. Department of Homeland Security has ICE and Customs and Border Protection. They're basically the enforcement arm of immigration. They are the ones who arrest immigrants who are here in violation of the law. They detain them. They are involved in deporting them. USCIS, Citizenship and Immigration Services, are part of DHS, but they're who immigrants actually apply to in order to get immigration status in the United States. DOS, Department of State, is mostly for people who aren't yet inside the United States. They're people who want to travel here from another country. They have to apply for a visa. That's all done through the DOS. Finally, DOJ are the ones who actually run the immigration courts. The immigration courts are not an independent court system like normal federal courts or state courts. They're actually part of the executive branch of the government. And so DOJ runs them, and when we go to immigration court, we're actually arguing against ICE attorneys. So it's a little confusing and strange, but if it doesn't work out in immigration court, you can always appeal to the federal courts. So there is a way to get out. Anyway, those are the government branches involved in immigration stuff. Next, what actually is immigration status? So when we talk about immigrants, we're talking about a lot of sort of a spectrum of people. So at the top, obviously, are US citizens. It's not really an immigrant status, but it just means you don't have to worry about being deported. You have full rights of anyone in the United States. Also, well, I'll say in a second, but the next step is a permanent resident in the United States. If you've heard of someone having a green card, that's what this is. They are allowed to stay in the United States indefinitely. They have a lot of the same rights as US citizens, except for things like voting. And they are still in danger of being deported if they commit certain crimes, for example, or if they leave the United States for an extended period of time. I've used USC and LPR there as abbreviations for US citizen, lawful permanent resident. If you see those throughout the presentation, that's what they mean. Besides U.S. citizens and permanent residents, you have non-immigrants. Before that, I'll also mention refugees because I know that's something you guys are concerned about. Refugees are also kind of in a permanent resident status, but it's a little different. Non-immigrants are here with just a temporary status. They're going to have to leave. They have a specific date they need to leave by. Students, tourists, business people, things like that. Below that are certain humanitarian immigration statuses, which basically allow you to stay here until the government says you can't anymore. They're not usually ways to get a green card. It's just, we're going to let you stay because of an emergency or your country's dangerous or something like that. Finally, there's not having any immigration status at all, often undocumented, or in the case of someone who overstays a visa, technically they were documented, but they now have no status. Okay, who's actually allowed to come to the United States? So I'll go into the specifics of how you're able to do it, but there's some basic, like, eligibility criteria. So you have to be admissible to come to the United States. To be admitted really just means that we're going to let you come here as an immigrant, or if you're already in the United States, you still have to be admitted if you're going to become a permanent immigrant here. So a lot of undocumented people, if they have a way to apply for immigration status, they're going to have to be admitted to the US, even though they're already here. These are terms for it. Consular processing is when you get your immigration status outside the United States. Adjustment of status is when you get it inside the United States. People who can't immigrate to the United States, typically. I mentioned there are some exceptions and waivers you can get, but people who violated any of our immigration laws, often that means even if you might be eligible in some way, you can't usually come to the United States or adjust status if you're already here. If you've committed any crimes, that can often be a bar to actually being admitted into a permanent status here. A big one that often catches people is very basic marijuana offenses. Just possession, which is legal in Michigan, but it is illegal federally, and that will immediately bar you from ever immigrating here. The public charge rule, you may or may not have heard of this, but basically, if the government thinks you will become dependent on the government for cash, basically, they can say that you're not able to permanently immigrate here. There's a bunch of other sort of small things, but those tend to be the big ones that make it you inadmissible. You cannot be admitted to the United States. But then, who actually can immigrate in the first place? We have a sort of blood, sweat, and tears are the ways that you can immigrate. It's not easy. Not everyone can immigrate to the United States. In fact, a lot of people cannot. But these are the kind of three ways that are available. So I'll go through each of these in turn. Family-based immigration is the most common way that people come to the United States. Basically, you already have to have family here in order. Both U.S. citizens and some lawful permanent residents can petition for family to come to the United States, but it's only ever immediate family. So like parents, my kids, my wife, my siblings. And some of those only U.S. citizens can actually petition for, like your parents or your siblings. It can take a very long time to immigrate this way, depending. Certain categories, like spouses of U.S. citizens, that can actually be very quick. You just have to wait for your application to be processed. Now, that application can take anywhere from a few months to a year or two, but once that's approved, you can come here straight away. Other categories, not so much. If I have kids who are over 21 years old, even if I'm a US citizen, I'm not petitioning for them. Right now, it's taking anywhere from 10 to 20 years before they can actually come to the United States. If it's one of my siblings, over 20 years. So while these are options, they are not necessarily reasonable options. The other ways from employment, this is frankly a very limited category of immigration. There are several temporary ways to immigrate, which I'll show on the next slide, but there's not many ways to immigrate permanently through your employment. It's usually limited to very high levels of education, people with PhDs or medical degrees, things like that. Usually the employer has to actually petition for you to come to the United States. They have to pay for everything. They have to fill out the paperwork. And again, you can have really long waits for this, especially if you're from a country like China or India, where we already have a lot of people coming from that country. Um, there are some temporary ways to work here. We have the H-1B, which some of you may have heard because there was some recent news about a new $100,000 fee to do that. The H-2A, the H-2B, these are basically ways to just work here temporarily, not a way to get a green card here, not a way to stay here permanently, but to do just some seasonal work in the United States. Oh, yeah. Finally, the tiers, humanitarian-based ways of immigrating to the United States. And so if you are undocumented in the United States, this is very likely going to be your only way that you might ever get some sort of status in the United States. It tends to be victim-based. You've suffered a great deal in your country or in the United States, and you might have ways to adjust status because of it. So I'll start with refugees. I have refugees and asylees here. They're basically the same thing. It really just matters about where you're applying from. Refugees come from outside the United States. They find some sort of aid organization that they work with. And that aid organization refers them to the U.S. Department of State. I don't remember exactly who, but basically they're allowed to come here as a refugee. They already have the status when they come here. Asylees are people who have to apply for asylum once they're already here. They didn't have any status, or they had some other status when they arrived here, but they're applying for asylum now that they are here. The definition of an asylee or a refugee otherwise is the same. They're both people who are fleeing persecution. And so, what does that mean? It means that you are outside of your country. You are either not able to or unwilling to return there because you fear being persecuted based off certain factors. You have to be being persecuted because of your race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or because you belong to some sort of group. If that does not apply to you, you are not a refugee. And so I have the example here, Ukrainian refugees. I say that colloquially because if you're fleeing war, that does not make you a refugee under the definitions of our immigration law. You have to show that you specifically were being targeted, maybe because of your Ukrainian nationality, maybe, or because you spoke out against the war, for example, a political opinion. You can't just say, my home was destroyed and there was a parole program that I was able to come here on. That's not a refugee. There's certain requirements when you're trying to apply as an asylee. You have to do it within 1 year of being here, typically. The way you do it is either, if you're not already being deported, basically, you can file an application with USCIS and you just wait a while. Or if you are in immigration court, you can basically use this as a defense to being deported. You can say, please don't send me back. I have a well-founded fear of being persecuted there. That's a defensive application. Affirmative is a lot better because you just have an interview with an officer to decide your case. They'll just ask you questions. It's a lot less combative as opposed to being in immigration court and having a prosecutor from ICE cross-examine you on the stand. People who are applying for asylum do get work authorization. You don't get it until 6 months after you apply for it, but they can work in the United States while their applications are pending, which is good because you'll see in the next slide, you could be waiting upwards of 10 years before your application is decided. That said, if you don't have another status, even though you could be working, you could also be detained by ICE at any time. There's nothing stopping them from detaining you if they want to. And right now they're making the case that they could probably detain you indefinitely without bond. But some difficulties right now. The refugee program, the one where you apply for it outside the US, you get referred, you come here as a refugee, that is indefinitely paused unless you are a white South African. So that is not an option any longer. You used to be able to apply for asylum at the border. That's how people saw as the right way to do it. You come to the border, you ask to come in with asylum. That is no longer an option. Really, the only way to apply for asylum now is to come here unlawfully and do it, or through some other immigration status. Like I said, it can take over 10 years to get a decision, and I have here that it's difficult just to know who's going to even count as a refugee. If my family is being extorted in El Salvador by gang violence that the government's not controlling, It's not clear whether that counts as a refugee. Why are they targeting me? It all comes back to, is it my race, my religion, my political opinion? Am I part of some group? So what counts as part of some group tends to be the crux of the matter for a lot of these cases, and that changes with administrations. Besides refugee and asylum, there are some other tiers-based ways of immigrating to the United States, or immigrating, I should say, adjusting status once you're already here, really. If you're the victim of a serious crime, there's a way you can get a visa to stay in the United States. Like refugees or asylum, I should say, it has a very long wait time right now. 10 years might be optimistic. It might be closer to 20. T visas are another way to stay here if you basically came here through human trafficking and you work with US authorities to try to get the people who help traffic you here. Special immigrant juvenile status is usually for kids who arrive in the United States and we say they can't be sent back because they were abused, abandoned, or neglected by one or both of their parents. They also, I mean, the applications themselves are usually adjudicated within 6 months, but then they have to wait for a visa to be available, and that can be, again, somewhere like 10 years, maybe more. The Violence Against Women Act is also just one other thing where you might be married to a US citizen or a lawful permanent resident. Normally, they could just apply for you that way, but if they're abusive, if they're holding it over you, if they're using it to manipulate you, usually you can petition for yourself under the Violence Against Women Act. These are ways that you can just kind of stay in the United States. It's not a way to immigrate here. It's not a way to stay here permanently, but they're temporary statuses. And I'm mentioning them because they're pretty well known, I think. One is parole. Usually this is a case-by-case basis. You can be paroled into the United States if you have some sort of medical emergency and need treatment, or if you have a dying family member. We've historically had, recovering from a cold, and my throat's still a little scratchy. We have, particularly in the Biden administration, had some basically country-based parole programs where we're saying because of the circumstances in Ukraine or Afghanistan, we will simply create a parole pathway for everyone from that country to come. Well, sorry, not everyone, but a lot of people to come in from that country. Temporary protected status is a way for people to stay in the United States if they're already here from a country that has a lot going on, basically. So places like Venezuela, Syria, places that have a lot of violence going on in them. They're very dangerous. The government can designate them as a place that we won't send you back to. You can stay here for the moment. And then finally, deferred action. So you've probably heard of DACA. That actually stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. This is something the government can give to people that protects them from deportation temporarily and also gives them a way to work in the United States. It's something the government can take away pretty much at any time. DACA has special protections because of the circumstances of it, but they sometimes give these to the people who are waiting for 10, 20 years to get a green card through the U visa or the special immigrant juvenile status. Not anymore, but they were doing that. Okay, I had on here, that's basically the only ways that you can actually immigrate to the United States. That's most of it. There's always very few exceptions things, but they don't apply to the vast, vast, vast majority of people. These are just a few slides on how people actually get here. You can either be admitted on a visa, you can be paroled in, you can enter without being inspected. I've kind of covered some of this. What is a visa? It's really just a document that lets you come here, or adjust status if you're already here. There's immigrant visas, non-immigrant visas. Immigrant just means permanent, like a lawful permanent resident. That's usually what we mean when we say immigrant. Non-immigrant means someone who's coming here but not staying here, like a student or a tourist. And the reason I bring up visas is because this is why people have to wait so long, so often. By law, only a certain number of visas in different categories can be issued in any given year. And so these are the limits here. There's 226,000 family-based visas per year, 140,000 employment-based ones. If they run out of visas for a given year, it just backs up. People are waiting for the visas to become available the next year. Statuses like the U visa have a limit, and they back up very quickly if you have a lot of applicants, which is why people are waiting 20 years until they'll actually be able to apply for a green card. Because that's basically you get the visa and then you can immediately apply for the green card. So, yeah. So much for immigrating here. Once you're actually here, living in the United States as an immigrant, all immigrant children are entitled to attend public school. The Supreme Court decided this. They have a right to it. Higher education is a little different, especially when it comes to financial aid. Usually, you're not eligible for financial aid unless you are a lawful permanent resident. Employment and taxes. So, a lot of immigration statuses, including those that aren't like permanent statuses, allow you to work here. So, if you have TPS, you can work here. If you've been paroled in, you can work here. Deferred action. A pending asylum application. I mentioned after 6 months, you can usually start working. You're issued an employment authorization document. That's an example of it. It looks a lot like just a normal ID. You also get a social security number. Yeah. Okay. Working without work authorization is not actually a crime. They can't like fine you or put you in prison for that, but it is an immigration violation, and it will stop you from being able to immigrate depending on your status. Uh, People without immigration status still have employment rights. They still have like the right to I'm gonna blank if I try to actually enumerate them right now. But labor rights apply to undocumented immigrants. And so most of them don't know that, but that's why we, for example, can help people who are working here, even if they don't necessarily have any immigration status. Finally, undocumented immigrants do pay taxes. Even if they don't have social security numbers, they can apply for a individual taxpayer ID number. If they have any sort of W-2, they still are getting their wages withheld. They're still paying into Social Security and Medicare. And to be clear, they can't actually take advantage of any of those benefits. But a lot of them do, not all of them, but a lot of undocumented immigrants are paying taxes. Uh, as far as what public benefits they can access, the answer is very few, especially if they're federally funded. There's next to no federally funded benefits they're getting right now, especially if they're means tested, like the things like food stamps, cash assistance, anything like that. Unless you've been a permanent resident here for at least 5 years, you're probably not getting them. There are some exceptions with like refugees. If you actually have that status, you can, but that is also in question right now. Yes. I think we skipped. Yeah. Okay, we're good. There's like a little menu that's okay. I do. We mentioned here that lawful permanent resident children are eligible for SNAP. That's kind of an exception. If you have a U.S. citizen child who has parents who are not in any sort of immigration status, they can still benefit from public benefits. If you're undocumented, the only sort of medical care you have access to, at least for as a public benefit, is emergency services, but you do have that. And I don't think any immigrant statuses allow you to get unemployment insurance or workers' comp. At least undocumented. I guess I actually don't know about lawful permanent residence for that. There are some pretty basic services that historically even undocumented immigrants were able to access. Federally funded domestic violence shelters, WIC, certain crisis centers for substance abuse, Head Start, soup kitchens. The Trump administration is trying to stop all that. It's paused in litigation, but we'll see how it goes. It doesn't Some of this is strictly state funded or locally funded charity donations, whatever it might be, but a lot of that is actually federally funded, especially depending on the state. Okay, finally, getting citizenship in the United States. So there's an obvious benefit of becoming a citizen, which is you no longer have to worry about being deported. You now have all the rights of any US citizen. You can vote, you can run for public office, you get all the scholarships for higher education you need. You can apply for your family members to come to the United States. There's some disadvantages. It depends on the country that you might lose your citizenship with that country or something. But if you plan to stay in the United States, it's usually recommended you try to become a US citizen. The requirements to do that usually have to be 18. Some kids can become US citizens if their parents do. You have to have been a green card holder for 5 years. You have to have resided in the United States continuously for a significant period, I think 3 years. You have to have a good moral character. Immigration law is full of things like that, or crimes involving moral turpitude, all these weird terms for it. But basically, you have to. Historically, this meant you haven't committed serious crimes for the past 5 years. You haven't done things that I guess a United States citizen wouldn't do, is the thought. Now they actually also want you to show that basically you are a respected community member. You have to send in letters of support or something to show that you contribute positively to your community. You have to know some amount of English, at least, and certain waivers for disability or age. And same goes for you have to pass a civics test. Then you have to swear allegiance, pay a fee. If you meet all that, you should be good. There are other ways to get citizenship. I have a feeling most of the people in this room were born as US citizens. Birthright citizenship. You can acquire it from your parents, even if you're not born in the United States. If your parents are US citizens, so are you. You can derive it. This is what I mentioned. Children can become citizens. If their parents were permanent residents, they're a permanent resident. If their parents become citizens, they just automatically get it. Okay, finally, deportation. So I think I mentioned this on the next slide. Deportation and removal are basically the same thing. We use the term removal because that's what the official legal term became in 1996, but they mean the same thing. So the normal process of being deported is you get arrested by ICE. I say here, if you commit a crime, often ICE is alerted of that fact and they might come to the jail and pick you up right after you get let out. You could have had an application denied with USCIS. You applied for some sort of status. They denied that status. Now you don't have a status. ICE comes to pick you up. Or they just did a workplace raid, a random stop, any way they find you. Without immigration status, they arrest you. They may or may not put you in immigration detention. At the very least, they'll serve you with a notice that you have to show up in immigration court. You then get your day in court. You do not necessarily get a lawyer. You have the right to a lawyer, but the government's not going to give you one. So you have to pay for it yourself. It's not like if you're charged with a crime where you get a public defender or something like that. If a judge, then, you get a chance to say, I'm not removable. Actually, I'm eligible for this status. Please let me apply or something like that. But if you don't really have any options, the judge is going to order you deported. You have the chance to appeal. Again, that usually involves paying money, involves legal know-how, typically. A lot of people will not appeal the decision, and they will be deported. I mentioned there the term changes. Who can be deported? If you don't have an immigration status here, you can be deported, period. If you've violated one of the US immigration laws, you could also be deported. Again, it depends on your status, whether that makes you deportable or not. But for most people, if you violate immigration laws, that's going to put you in danger. Now, if you are found to be removable from the United States in immigration court, you do have defenses. I mentioned asylum earlier. I have here the two defenses are I'll be in danger or they need me here. Asylum is basically you're saying, I know I'm removable, but please don't send me back because I will be persecuted if you do. Asylum is a pretty strict standard, as I mentioned before. It's narrow. You have to prove you're being persecuted because of something. But there are other things like the Convention Against Torture. Basically, if you can show that there's a greater than 50% chance if you're sent back, you will be tortured, and the government will let it happen. They won't send you back, but they might send you to Uganda or South Sudan or a third country. Sorry. Mm. The other thing I was going to mention is something called cancellation of removal. If you've been here long enough and you have an immediate relative that's a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident, and you can show that they would suffer some sort of extremely unusual hardship, then you might be able to stay and get a green card even. But that's a pretty tough standard. Expedited removal is basically a way to subvert the normal process. You don't go to court. They find you and they just send you back immediately. Historically, this was something that was only really ever used for people who are arriving at the border. If Customs and Border Patrol finds you, you've been here like a day, they caught you in the desert or something, they don't think you have any credible fear of going back to your home country. They just send you back. You don't go to court. And there might be some sense to that. The new administration has been expanding this to basically anyone who's undocumented and can't show they've been here for at least 2 years, as well as anyone who's ever been allowed into the United States for any reason. I shouldn't say that, who's been paroled into the United States before. So if you were admitted on a visa or something, it wouldn't apply to you. But if you were admitted here in order to apply for asylum, for example, under one of the Biden programs, unless you now have some sort of immigration status, this would apply to you. At least that's what they're trying to say. This is currently blocked by a lawsuit, but we will see how that goes. And there are some exceptions to it. Like if you're already in immigration court, they can't do this to you. You have to go through the court process. Children, typically, this won't apply to, at least if they arrived here without their parents. And if someone shows that they have a credible fear of returning to their country, then they're not supposed to do this. They're not going to ask you, at least not under the Trump administration. But if you proactively make it very clear you are scared to go back, then they shouldn't be doing this. Okay. That is all the Immigration 101. I'm sure that was a lot of stuff. But now I'm just going to go briefly through some of the new things immigrants are facing under the Trump administration, how the law and circumstances are changing. First, the administration is eliminating some of the options people previously had. So, as I mentioned, there's no more refugee program. That's gone. Biden implemented something called CBP-1. This was an app that basically you could schedule an appointment to enter the United States in an orderly fashion to apply for asylum. That's gone. You can't apply at the border, period. There were parole-based programs for Ukraine, for Haiti. Those are gone. TPS is something that has been in constant flux. The administration has been taking it away from Haiti, from Venezuela, more recently Syria. I know there are other countries, but I can't think of them. They've attempted to end birthright citizenship. This really, because this has been stalled in the courts, it's not really a concern right now. I don't think it will work. But it also does only apply to people who have children here and they don't have any immigration status. It's been tough because even the legal standards are changing. So student visas have been in question because of language, they might say, the speech they might post on social media, for example, or even minor crimes that may have occurred while on a student visa, like driving uninsured or something. That has suddenly led to revocations of the visas, but then reinstatement. Um, Now the government's scrutinizing them again. It can just be stressful for students with these visas. TPS, particularly with Venezuela, the government ended it, a lawsuit stopped it, an appeals court affirmed that, the Supreme Court overturned it, the lower court then implemented a new stop of it. Basically, people are having, they don't know if they have TPS or not. And it's very unclear how it's going to go. The administration isn't always transparent in terms of whether you should have it or not. So it's just very difficult if you are a Venezuelan who's relying on TPS right now. And then some of the standards for things have been changing. I've already mentioned the asylum issue a couple times, but they're now doing neighborhood checks for anyone who wants to become a citizen. This was something they did a very long time ago. They're starting it again, and theoretically, this shouldn't be a big deal, but for someone who lives in a neighborhood that might have some people without immigration status, it might make people think twice about applying for citizenship. I mentioned speech already. A lot of immigration statuses, the government doesn't have to give them to you. They can just decide that you're not worthy, basically, of immigrating here. That's what discretion is. And basically, under the Trump administration, it's going to be harder to show that you are someone they should give immigration status to. Due process has been an issue. I mentioned the expedite removal expansion. Some of you may have heard of the Alien Enemies Act they were attempting to do for some Venezuelans. That was basically just deporting them without any sort of hearing because they are an invading army. Um, they have begun pre-termitting asylum applications. That basically means they deny them and don't give you a chance to have a hearing because they think it's frivolous. They think legally you just don't have a case. We're not going to give you much of a chance to say anything, so we're just going to kick you out. People getting arrested when they go to immigration court. It just makes people less likely to participate in the process. Lawyers have been getting targeted to some degree. I mean, obviously not in the same way, but we've been the target of executive orders that say that we are doing a lot of frivolous applications and we need to be sanctioned and scrutinized. They have defunded organizations, mine included. We actually had roughly half of our staff fired because we lost a lot of funding that later was given back, but now it's only given back for 3 months at a time, which makes hiring new staff very difficult because we can only give them job security for 3 to 6 months. Some people have reported being unable to access a lawyer or call their family once they're in ICE detention. If you get in ICE detention, you also often get ferreted around to different detention centers. Someone who gets detained here might get bused to Louisiana, and their lawyer might not know they were detained until they're already gone. And then the administration has also been eliminating oversight bodies. And so these are independent organizations within DHS, independent, that are supposed to make sure that the government's doing what it's supposed to be doing when it processes immigration applications, things like that. That's also something that's currently halted by a lawsuit, at least to some degree, but they're trying their darndest. Mass deportation, I mean, I assume everyone here knows that massive funding has been given to ICE in order to expand both their workforce and the detention centers all around the United States. New ones are being built in Michigan. I know of one in Baldwin, I believe. I don't know if others are being built as well. They're doing more and more raids of workplaces, but also just random stops of people in neighborhoods that have a lot of immigrants in them. They have ended the sensitive locations policy. So it used to be that, for example, ICE wouldn't raid a church like this. That is no longer the case. They are now trying to say that anyone who's ever detained should be detained indefinitely. Normally, people can ask for bond. They can say, I'm not a flight risk. I'm not going to hurt anyone. Can I just be let out while my proceedings are going on? Especially because it can be months or even years. But the administration is saying, actually, the law should be interpreted that there's no bond. You just have to be detained until we figure out your case. They're coordinating with organizations that historically they haven't, or we even thought was illegal, like the IRS, in order to track down undocumented immigrants in the United States. And this was a wild one. Just a few weeks ago, they basically, in the middle of the night, tried to deport a bunch of children that were in government custody under certain, like, rules, basically, because they're unaccompanied children. They said they were repatriating them to their parents because their parents wanted them back, which was actually just not true. Um, they got criticized heavily in court for that, and that has been paused, and they were not successful, but one of the many things they're trying. And then it's just life is harder generally. I mean, aside from all these other things, if a state is currently providing benefits to immigrants, if they are considered a sanctuary city, the federal government is definitely trying to find ways to punish those cities and potentially take away funding. The government has implemented new fees for immigration applications, many of which have no fee waivers. So if you're poor, it's becoming harder and harder to even apply. The government has been firing the people that process immigration applications, which causes delays, it causes mistakes, it causes overwork by those employees. This one I mentioned specifically because we work with a lot of children that have special immigrant juvenile status. That's what that SIJ is. That's the children who come here and apply for some sort of status because they were abused or neglected or abandoned by their parents. These children are waiting for a decade or more to get a visa. The government has removed what used to be deferred action given to them automatically. So while they're waiting here for like a decade, they will not be able to work, and the government really could deport them anytime it wanted to, and then they would lose the status, which makes it basically meaningless. That is also being challenged in a lawsuit, but we'll see how it goes. The government has already removed most, if not all, of its non-English pages from its website, which just is an inconvenience that was not necessary for a lot of people that could have used that information. And I just put here just the atmosphere of fear that all of this has created. People are not going to the doctor when they should be going to the doctor. They are scared to send their kids to school, or kids are scared to go to school. It's sad. What can you do? um, So I will warn you, the answer is not a lot because a lot of this is simply out of our hands. But, we do have some power. And I'll start with the fact that immigrants do have rights in the country. They may not have all the same rights as U.S. citizens, but they have the basic due process, constitutional rights, the right to be free of an unreasonable search and seizure, the right to remain silent. These can be particularly important if anyone's in danger of being detained. It's important they know these facts because it might stop ICE from being able to immediately deport them. It might prevent them from signing things that they don't understand that basically is agreeing to let ICE deport. It can make it so that they might be eligible for an immigration status they might otherwise not get. So it's important they know their rights. Okay. Yeah. So one of the things you can do if you know any immigrant communities, if you know any groups that work with immigrants on a regular basis, you can make sure that the immigrants they work with are prepared. We have guides on our website. There's a link there, there's a QR code there. You can just Google it. Honestly, we try to make it easy enough to find. These guides tell people about their rights. They tell people the sorts of things they should do to prepare just in case ICE does any sort of enforcement action on them. It can be pretty important, for example, to have a delegation of parental authority if you have kids and you get arrested. Because if you don't have that in place, your kids might get put in foster care or something like that. It's in multiple languages, so spreading that awareness is something you can do. This is sort of just based off our guide, but just making sure people are ready, make sure they have their documents together. If they follow the Know Your Rights guide, they're kind of getting all of this information already. And if they can, talk to a lawyer. As a church, I know you don't have many immigrant parishioners, is my understanding, but it's good to be aware, at least, or you could tell other churches as well, that if ICE, for example, ever wanted to come to your church, they are allowed to enter any public space. They are not allowed to enter private spaces without a warrant or your consent. One of the things we recommend is clearly demarcating private areas. And this applies to any sort of business, school, anywhere in public, basically. They need a warrant to go into any private space unless you let them. And so clearly demarcating what's not available to the public can be important if you don't want ICE to be able to just come in and take people they want to take. Um, ICE often presents a warrant that is not a real warrant. Um, it is a little crazy to me. It is an administrative warrant, which has no actual effect of law that would allow them to just go into your private areas. I don't necessarily expect you to try to identify the difference between an administrative warrant and a judicial warrant. I would say chances are they do not have a judicial warrant. Chances are they don't have a warrant that actually lets them go into your private spaces. And frankly, if they do, they don't have to listen to you telling them they don't have to go in there. They can just do it. But the crux of it is a judicial warrant is actually signed by a judge. It's going to say it's from a court. An ICE warrant is going to say it's from DHS, and it's going to be signed by an immigration officer. It might look different than this, but that's the very basics of it. If it's not from an actual court, if it says it's from DHS, if it says something about like deportation order, that's not a warrant that actually lets them go into private spaces. Again, this gets into a little bit of a I don't expect you guys to try to act as lawyers in this situation and closely evaluate warrants, but it's good to know that a lot of their warrants are not really warrants. It's important to be aware of some of the laws around this as well. There are a lot of organizations that do things like warn immigrants about upcoming raids or things like that. It is important to know that that could be construed as harboring, which is a federal crime. It's unclear whether the government is going to enforce things like that, but any attempt to harbor, conceal, or shield someone from detection by immigration officials is a federal crime. So anyone engaged in that should be aware of that. The law is vague, I will say that, and telling ICE that they can't go into your private spaces is not going to be harboring. That's just exercising your rights. But you should be aware that if you warn someone, for example, someone specific, like ICE is coming, you should get out, that could be grounds for a harboring charge. Especially lying to ICE or anything like that. That's definitely never do that. Obstruction of justice, if you physically are stopping them from arresting someone, that's also a federal crime. Yeah, it's just important to know if you are in space, I think. Finally, the sorts of things that you might be able to do, especially as an organization. Advocacy is always something that community groups can try to engage in. Just getting a bunch of people to call their state representatives, whether that's in the US Congress or actually the state reps. We have call scripts. Like I said, I'll be sharing these slides. You can actually go to this link. We say, sorry, we say to advocate for policies generally, but I even have, oh wait, maybe I don't have a list. We have historically had a list of specific bills that you can even tell them to not support, but I think just generally telling them to support support immigrant, pro-immigrant policies. Please reject anti-immigrant policies. That sends a clear message. And finally, I mean, I already mentioned sharing Know Your Rights materials. You can try to fundraise for organizations. There are mutual aid networks, basically organizations that work with immigrants. I put one specifically here that I know that we work with. It's the Washtenaw Interfaith Coalition for Immigrant Rights. It might be worth checking out if your group wants to talk with them. And we also post updates about major policy changes. Just being aware of those can be something to help you keep abreast of everything that's going on. It can be useful as something to do. Oops. But that's about it. I know it's not super hopeful, but that's all I got. Thank you. Um,